Why do you tarry, Caius? There is no escape. One life and one death is appointed for us both, to spend the one and to meet the other in service of the people. According to Cicero, the ghost of Tiberius Gracchus appeared to his younger brother in a dream and, with these words, urged him to eschew a life of leisure and to hurry into statesmanship and to follow him into mortal conflict with the state. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. My name is Rob Paxton, and this is the 25th episode of my podcast series on the Roman Empire. Today's episode will cover the political career of Caius Gracchus, the younger brother of Tiberius Gracchus, and the continuing descent of the Roman Republic into a state of disorder. Tiberius Gracchus, the older brother, had launched a brief but tumultuous career in politics when he was elected as a tribune of the people in 133 BC. He had died a martyr for land and liberty that same year, the patrician faction pushing his body into the river, even while they conceded his point that somehow land had to be redistributed to the poor through the commission that he had proposed. Caius Gracchus followed in his older brother's footsteps. Tiberius had been young as it was, though, when elected as a tribune, just having reached 30 years of age. Caius himself was 9 years younger, so he would have to wait before such an opportunity came his way. In the meantime, though, he had been appointed, at the age of just 22, to serve on the upcoming Land Commission, and he would hold a number of middle management positions in Rome in the following years, always, though, with his eye on higher and higher office. With more power would come more opportunity to provide some sort of quality of life for the common people of Rome, and as well as the opportunity to revenge himself on the establishment that had murdered his brother. Now, before we get into all that, though, let me address a few other things. First, my pronunciation. I have mentioned before that classical Latin sounds a lot different than people usually think. The easiest example to point out is the name Julius Caesar. We all recognize that as his name, but that is not his name. The historical figure to whom we apply that name was actually known, in his time, by his tria nomina as Caius Julius Caesar. And Cicero, the great Roman orator, he was actually called Cicero, but that name doesn't have a very Ciceronian sound, does it? Anyway, as much as I would like to be a snob and force you to hear awkward sounding but authentic Roman names, I'm going to mostly stick with the names to which we are accustomed to hearing. I will call Caesar's great opponent Pompey, for example, and not Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. And secondly, if you have looked up these personages yourself, you may see their names spelled and pronounced using a hard English G sound, whereas I'm pronouncing it often with a C sound. I say Caius Gracchus, but you may read on your own in some other source Gaius Gracchus. That is because I am mostly using older translations, which translated the Greek letters of most early sources somewhat differently. It's not terribly important, but don't be surprised if you go and read something which replaces my C's with G's. Also, I will frequently speak in this episode and many to come of wheat, that is, the cereal crop with which we make bread. If you pursue your own reading in this area, you may hear a lot about the quote unquote price of corn in Rome or the quote unquote distribution of corn. If you are an American, this can be confusing, so I have changed the word to wheat, even if this may not always be strictly accurate as to the specific type of European cereal being referenced, one of the various kinds of wheat or even barley. My point is to prevent you from thinking that the Romans had maize, or what some call Indian corn. In America, the word corn means the bright yellow stuff that grows in Kansas and Nebraska, but in Europe, corn is and was essentially synonymous with wheat. So if I forget along the way and you hear me say corn, that is just me mouthing what I read in some old translation. It doesn't mean that the Romans were eating corn on the cob. There was no maize corn available in Europe until after the discovery of the New World in 1492. Finally, please remember to visit my website at western-traditions.org, where you can find the episodes from all my podcast series about everything from the ancient world, Greek history, the Bible, and an assortment of other topics pertinent to Western civilization. And please also remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. These are easy ways to support my work. You can also buy t-shirts, hats, and other Western Traditions merchandise on the shopping page. If you wish to contribute more directly to the cause and help me with the price of corn in my own neck of the woods, you can find links to PayPal or to Patreon on my website. If you become a Patreon member, you get access to behind the scenes happenings in the podcast, updates about the future directions of things, and I also post interesting historical links and videos about topics pertinent to the past, present, and future of the West. Now, though, let's turn back to the final decades of the 2nd century BC, when Caius Gracchus and a growing number of other young aristocratic men are seizing opportunities to take control of the Roman state and steer it in an entirely new direction. Caius Gracchus followed his brother into politics and diligently prepared himself for his coming ascension to the role of statesman. Plutarch tells us that he devoted himself, when he could, to the study of eloquence. I say when he could because Caius did not have the luxury of entering a school or studying while leading a life of leisure. His duties as a Roman citizen kept him fairly busy. In 126 BC, he served as quaestor under the consul in charge of Sardinia. Now, this island province was ever a thorn in Rome's side, the people there being unusually rebellious. In fact, even today, Sardinia retains a cultural and linguistic distinction from the rest of Italy, and it would not be a boring side quest for you to look it up sometime. But anyway, back to Caius Gracchus. His political opponents had hoped to sideline the younger Gracchi with this assignment to Sardinia, but he mastered the challenge more than adequately. When the consular army stationed there found itself ill supplied for an unexpectedly harsh winter, Caius was the one who managed to properly clothe the troops. A quaestor was, among other things, something like a quartermaster. The consul wanted to put the burden of clothing the legions onto the local island cities, and these cities appealed to the Senate to be relieved of this burden. The Senate, perhaps wishing to make things difficult for Caius and to impede his ambition, accepted the plea of the cities in Sardinia and sent back orders to the consul and to his quartermaster Caius that they must find some other way to supply the troops. But Caius Gracchus overcame. He traveled personally to each of the surrounding cities and directly negotiated fresh supplies for his men, his natural charisma winning over the normally seditious locals. The Senate was further frustrated and displeased when it learned that one of the kings over their African provinces had sent a large supply of wheat to the legions in Sardinia simply out of respect for Caius, to aid this admirable Roman. So the young Gracchi brother was both fostering fresh love for his role as up and coming political hero and receiving renewed devotion from people everywhere for his character and compassion. The Senate tried to dispel this new rising adoration for the young man. The legions in Sardinia, now devoted to this young officer, were suddenly ordered home to be replaced by new troops. But the consul and his quaestor, Caius Gracchus, were ordered to stay on the island and assume command of the new troops who had no special reason to love their quartermaster. Thus, Caius would have to start all over trying to cast a spell with his charisma. Enraged by this maneuver, Caius took ship and went to Rome, appearing before the Senate to complain. Now, this was an unorthodox move, and even fans of his among the people were somewhat aghast. He had essentially abandoned his post. It was a risky move, but his study and eloquence made it pay off. In his public harangue of the establishment, he outlined and emphasized his unusually extended service in the army ever since he was a teenager, and his apparent honesty in that he had spent much of his own money to support his own troops, while other officers regularly came home from these expeditions weighted down with loot. There was a public scandal, essentially, as the Senate leveled charges, both official and unofficial, at the man, and he countered them with all the tools of demagoguery. And so, amid all this chaos, Caius Gracchus stood for election as one of the next year's tribunes. And when he won, he basically went on a revenge trip, proposing law after law that would either injure those who had killed his brother or benefit the poor of Rome, or both. Plutarch puts the following words in the mouth of the younger Gracchi brother, who spoke to the people in reference to the senators. These men did, in the presence of you all, murder Tiberius with clubs, and they dragged the slaughtered body through the middle of the city to be cast into the river. Even his friends, as many as could be taken, were put to death immediately, without any trial. We must remember, when he spoke, that it was not simply the voice of some aggrieved legionary or some minor statesman who had been politically wronged. No, remember, this was the descendant of Scipio Africanus and many other heroes of Roman history. In our modern terms in the West in 2026, this would be like a descendant of George Washington or Ulysses Grant or George Patton or Winston Churchill or Charles de Gaulle, or a combination of those ancestors stepping forward and picking up the banner of democracy and rallying the people to his cause. It shook the city to its foundations. Among the many laws that he proposed, there were those that divvied out land to the urban poor so as to restore their financial independence, and there were laws to lower the price of wheat, and most impactfully, there were two other propositions. First, he wanted to elevate another 300 men from the knightly class to judicial authority. Now, the office of judge was usually only held by senators or men from that class, so this move would dilute senatorial control over legal matters. And second, Caius proposed to extend citizenship to all Italians, not just Romans of the city and those to whom citizenship had been granted previously. It was a kind of small step toward greater, if not universal, male suffrage. You can probably see where this was all heading. Given that they had murdered his brother for much less, Caius was taking on the enraged bull of the Senate with little apparent regard for his personal safety. Nevertheless, in the moment, with the masses of the city stirred into a frenzy, the senators knew that they could not immediately resist the young man. These laws were ratified. And these were more than just a series of revenge laws aimed at his brother's murderers. They were more than just laws pandering to the lower classes. Caius demonstrated that he was fully a statesman already. He also proposed to found new colonies, to build more roads, to found new public granaries. Soon he was surrounded by contractors and scholars and soldiers and others, all milling around the man who had, from his lowly office of tribune, become something of an executive, a known pariah, really. But certainly, in the mouth of every senator, it all savored of something like monarchy. So the Senate outdid him in pandering to the public. In his second year as tribune, the following year, the senators backed one of his fellow tribunes in making even grander gestures to the people. Caius Gracchus proposed two colonies, while his companion tribune and senatorial favorite, Livius Drusus, he proposed 12 colonies to which the poor might go and receive land. Caius proposed land division to the poor, but he also planned to charge a small rent from these new landowners to help fund the government. So Drusus proposed rent-free land division, and so on. And always Livius Drusus made it known that the Senate supported and backed these liberal proposals. Thus, the elites ever counter and undermine the spirit of populism. So things began to work against Caius Gracchus. He spent a short time away from Rome, in Carthage of all places, where he tried to establish a colony. While it is a bit mythological to say that Rome had cursed the ruins of the city and salted the land so that it might never be farmed, it is still true that there was something a little controversial about trying to renew civilization on that particular site, and multiple omens of one sort or another seemed to hinder the work there. There were great windstorms, and wolves allegedly carried away the markers that were set at the limits of the construction sites, and so on. Nevertheless, Caius intended to stand for election a third time to the office of tribune, and so when he returned from this debacle in Carthage, he moved his residence to a more humble area of town so as to be close to his supporters among the common people of Rome. By now, though, the Senate had organized its opposition. Caius was defeated in the elections for the year 121 BC, and he was not returned as a tribune. When the new consuls and tribunes took office, they immediately began planning to cancel the laws that the younger Gracchi had put through. On the day that the consuls were set to meet for just this purpose in the capital, a party loyal to Caius and another party loyal to the consuls in the Senate met contentiously, and in the struggle, one of the consul's attendants was killed. The next day, the Senate laid out the body of this murdered servant on a platform in front of the Senate House, and there was a great deal of crying and histrionics. The Senate then turned to one of their consuls by the name of Opimius, he whose attendant had been murdered, and they granted him extraordinary powers to protect the commonwealth in this time of internal distress. Opimius then ordered all the Roman men of the knightly class to arm themselves to defend the republic. In the meantime, Caius's supporters were also organizing. Caius himself made a great public show of standing before his father's statue and weeping openly. The next day, some of Caius's supporters went to see the consul Opimius, and they offered to negotiate an agreement with him. The consul denied any interaction and stated that the offenders must first surrender to the state and then hope for clemency. Caius and his followers presented themselves the next day then, but many of them were armed. A battle ensued. According to Plutarch, the consul Opimius, virtually operating as a dictator now, let loose squadrons of archers, and these brought down many of Caius's people. Caius himself, unarmed, fled on foot. First, he took refuge in the temple of Diana, and then a rearguard covered for him as he tried to leave the city. After crossing a bridge over the river Tiber, two armed friends agreed to defend the crossing so that he might have time to escape. He went on then with just one servant. But though many wished him well along the way, no one provided him with a horse. His pursuers closed on him. The would-be savior of the common people of Rome stopped in a sacred grove dedicated to the Furies, the triple goddesses of retribution. According to the most attested story, here Caius commanded his servant to kill him. The servant stabbed his master dead and then killed himself. Another story relates that both men were taken alive and then slain. An additional story about this matter states that a bounty had been placed, that whosoever should bring the head of Caius Gracchus to the Senate would receive, in exchange, the same weight in gold. A friend of Opimius, so the story goes, took the head, scooped out the brains, and filled the cranium with molten lead, before turning it in and getting paid 17 pounds of gold for the unusually heavy head. All in all, Plutarch tells us, 3,000 rebels were slain in the riot that day. The bodies of the offenders, including that of Caius Gracchus, were all thrown into the river. The Gracchi brothers were dead, but the revolution was hardly over. The common people set up statues of the two brothers and turned the location of these statues into a sort of pilgrimage site in the years to come. crowds regularly bringing gifts and worshiping there. Endopimius, the consul who had acted as dictator during this bloody scuffle in the capital, after his term as consul, he was sent as an ambassador to Numidia in Africa, and he was afterwards exposed for corruption in seeking and receiving gifts from the king there, and he was publicly stripped of all his honor. Now, amid all this disruption of the once supremely stable Republic of Rome, there were men who eyed the chaos and saw opportunity. Among them was Caius Marius, today remembered simply as Marius. He was not quite as young as Gracchus, being about 36 years old at the time of the riot. And he may actually have been serving in the army in Gaul at the time as one of the military tribunes, a type of field officer who served under the consul and who was not to be confused with the plebeian tribunes who held political office. There is no evidence, anyway, that he was in the capital in 121 BC, but he would be in the capital the next year and stand for election as a tribune of the people. In the next episode, we will hear more about Marius and how he picked up the banner of populism and democracy and turned the tremors caused by the Gracchi brothers into a full-blown political earthquake. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.